Welcome to Revenge with Roman, where betrayal, heartbreak, and shocking twists come alive through unforgettable stories. Today's tale is not just about love gone wrong, but about a husband blindsided in the most humiliating way possible. Imagine standing beside the woman you built a life with, only to be publicly mocked as a trial husband in front of her colleagues and friends. The sting of embarrassment was only the beginning, because she didn't stop there. Divorce papers came crashing down like a final insult. But what she never saw coming was a revenge he had been silently planning. Daniel adjusted his tie nervously as he stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection, and tried to convince himself that tonight was going to be about celebration. Emily, his wife, had worked tirelessly for years to reach this point, the grand opening of her own law firm. He had watched her spend countless nights hunched over documents, attending endless networking events, and pouring all her energy into making this dream a reality. He had supported her through it all, often sacrificing his own ambitions to ensure she had the space and freedom to succeed. Tonight was supposed to be the culmination of all that hard work, and Daniel wanted to be the proud husband standing at her side. As they arrived at the grand venue, Daniel felt the weight of the evening sink in. The law firm's new office gleamed under bright lights, with tall glass windows showcasing the lavish interior. Guests in elegant suits and dresses filled the room, champagne glasses in hand, exchanging polished laughter. Emily immediately slipped into hostess mode, her sharp dress and confident smile making her the center of attention. Daniel stayed close by, not wanting to overshadow her moment, but determined to show his unwavering support. He noticed how people gravitated toward her, eager to shake hands, congratulate her, and offer compliments about her determination and brilliance. Daniel smiled politely, his chest swelling with a quiet pride. He had seen her journey from beginning. The late nights when she doubted herself, the mornings when she left before sunrise to attend court hearings, and the tears she sometimes shed when it all felt overwhelming. He had always been there to remind her she was capable, that she could achieve anything she set her mind to. And tonight, looking at her radiant and in control, he felt a sense of validation. Their sacrifices as a couple had paid off. But even as he stood among the well-dressed guests, Daniel couldn't shake the faint feeling of being an outsider in Emily's world. He wasn't a lawyer, nor was he part of the legal elite. His career had been stable but modest compared to Emily's meteoric rise. He wondered if people noticed that, if they whispered about how he didn't quite fit in among the powerful attorneys and judges mingling across the room. He brushed the thought aside, reminding himself that tonight wasn't about him. Tonight was about Emily and her success. His role was to be supportive, proud, and present. The evening flowed with speeches and congratulations, and soon Emily was called to front to deliver her official opening remarks. Daniel stood near the front, watching her take the stage with her usual poise. She looked breathtaking under the spotlight, her voice commanding attention as she spoke about her journey, the challenges she had faced, and the excitement of building a new legacy with her firm. Her words drew applause and admiration, and Daniel clapped the loudest, his heart swelling as he thought about how far they had come together. As Emily's speech continued, she began weaving in personal anecdotes. At first, Daniel thought it was sweet, even touching, that she acknowledged their journey as a couple. But then her tone shifted, and the words that left her mouth made Daniel freeze. With a smirk, Emily joked to the audience that her marriage to Daniel was her trial run, her trial husband phase, as she called it, implying that everything before this moment had been temporary practice, something less than real. Laughter rippled to the crowd, but for Daniel, it felt like a knife twisting deep in his chest. He stood there, trying to keep his face composed, but inside, the humiliation burned like fire. The woman he had stood by, sacrificed for, believed in, had just reduced him to a punchline in front of her peers. He could feel eyes on him, some guests chuckling uncomfortably, others raising eyebrows as if wondering what kind of man would tolerate being mocked like that. His palms grew clammy, his jaw clenched, and his heart pounded against his ribs. Daniel's mind raced back through the years, the times he had chosen Emily's needs over his own, the nights he had cooked dinner alone while she stayed late at work, the moments he reassured her when her confidence wavered. All of it suddenly felt cheapened, dismissed as nothing more than a stepping stone in her climb to success. He wanted to believe she didn't mean it, that it was just a careless attempt at humor, but the smug look on her face told him otherwise. She had said it deliberately, fully aware of the sting it would cause. Even as the applause followed her closing words, Daniel couldn't bring himself to clap this time. His hands stayed still at his sides, and his throat tightened as he fought to keep his composure. On the surface, he remained calm, his expression neutral, but inside his heart ached with betrayal and shame. For the first time that evening, he questioned whether the woman standing so confidently in front of everyone was the same person he had fallen in love with, the same person he had believed in so deeply. After the speech ended, the air buzzed with applause, laughter, and clinking glasses, but Daniel felt as if the sound was coming from a distance. His ears rang, his chest tight, his mind replaying the phrase "trial husband" over and over like an echo that refused to fade. He forced himself to smile weakly as Emily stepped down from the stage and was immediately swarmed by colleagues and well-wishers. She basked in the attention, her laughter ringing out confidently, as though nothing unusual had happened. To everyone else, it might have just been a joke, but to Daniel, it was a wound, raw, deep, and humiliating. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to shake it off. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe Emily had just been nervous and tried to break the tension with humor. Yet, the way she looked at him, smirking, almost mocking, made his stomach twist. He wasn't imagining it. She had wanted to humiliate him, and she had succeeded. A waiter passed by, offering a tray of champagne, and Daniel took a glass, though he barely sipped it. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to steady himself. Guests glanced at him, some with polite smiles, others with curiosity. He could almost hear their unspoken thoughts. That's a husband she just mocked. That's a man standing there, pretending he isn't embarrassed. Each smile, each glance, felt like another needle pricking his pride. Daniel thought about leaving, just walking out of the elegant office space, stepping into the night and never looking back. But something inside him resisted. Leaving now would only make him look weaker, as if he couldn't handle the humiliation. No, he would stay. He would stand there, even if his insides felt hollow, because disappearing would give Emily exactly what she wanted, a silent surrender. Moments later, Emily made her way over to him, her face glowing with the triumph of the evening. She leaned close, her perfume strong and intoxicating, and whispered, "You handled that well. I was worried you'd look upset." She gave him a quick, dismissive smile before turning her attention to another guest who had come to shake her hand. Daniel's blood boiled. She hadn't even considered his feelings. It was as if he was just a prop in her show, someone to stand there and nod while she celebrated her independence at his expense. Then it happened. As Daniel tried to compose himself, Emily turned back to him, her eyes glinting with a cold amusement. In front of several of her colleagues, she reached into her designer bag and pulled out a crisp manila envelope. Without a trace of hesitation, she handed it to him. "Since tonight is about new beginnings," she said sweetly, loud enough for others to hear, "I thought it was the perfect time to give you this." Daniel stared at the envelope, his fingers numb as he took it. He didn't need to open it to know what it was. The weight of the moment crushed him. Divorce papers, delivered not in private, not with respect, but at her grand opening, in front of her peers, as if it were part of her performance. A fresh wave of laughter bubbled around them, though some faces showed shock, their eyes darting between husband and wife as if they had just witnessed a scene too intimate, too cruel for public display. The room tilted around Daniel. He wanted to speak, to call her out, to demand an explanation, but his throat closed up, his voice refusing to cooperate. Instead, he slipped the envelope under his arm, clenched his jaw, and forced a thin smile. If Emily expected him to crumble here, she would be disappointed. He would not give her the satisfaction of watching him break in front of her audience. Inside, however, his emotions roared. Shame, anger, betrayal, all colliding in a storm he struggled to contain. He thought of the years he had poured into their marriage, the nights he had encouraged her when she doubted herself, the money he had invested into their shared life so she could focus on her career. And now, she was discarding him like an outdated accessory, a fade she could laugh about while stepping into her new, polished future. The rest of the evening blurred. People approached him with awkward half-smiles, unsure what to say. and he nodded mechanically, his mind elsewhere. Emily didn't spare him another glance, too busy networking, laughing, and toasting with her new circle of allies. Daniel felt invisible, a ghost drifting through a party where he had once believed he belonged. When he finally stepped outside into the night air, the cool breeze hit his face, and the weight of the envelope pressed against his chest like a stone. He stood there on the sidewalk, staring at the glittering lights inside the building, and something inside him shifted. The humiliation had cut deep, but beneath it, another feeling began to rise, quiet, steady, unshakable. Daniel drove home in silence, the city lights blurring past his windshield as if they belonged to another world entirely. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, the manila envelope sitting on the passenger seat, like a ticking bomb. He couldn't bring himself to open it yet. He knew exactly what it contained, but part of him wasn't ready to face the reality spelled out in black ink, the legal severing of everything he had once thought unbreakable. His chest ached as if the words Emily had spoken earlier, trial husband, had been branded into his skin. When he pulled into the driveway of their house, a place that suddenly felt like it belonged more to her than to him, Daniel sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the dark windows. It didn't feel like home anymore. The warmth he once associated with those walls had been replaced with suffocating coldness. He picked up the envelope, weighing it in his hands, and finally forced himself to tear it open. Inside, as expected, were the divorce papers, neatly stapled, carefully worded. Every page a reminder that Emily had already moved on mentally and emotionally long before this night. What struck him wasn't just the cold legal language, but the swiftness of it. She had prepared this. She hadn't woken up one morning and decided to end things. No, she had planned it, choreographed it even, waiting for the grand unveiling of her firm to make the final act of betrayal public. Daniel sank into the couch, papers scattered across the coffee table, his head in his hands. Memories flooded him. Emily's laughter in their early days, the quiet dinners they used to share, the long walks when they dreamed about their future together. Those memories now felt like lies, carefully constructed illusions that had blinded him to the reality of who she truly was. He wondered how long she had seen him as nothing more than a placeholder, a stepping stone on her path to success. His anger simmered, mixing with grief until it became something darker, sharper. At first, he thought about simply signing the papers and walking away. Why fight for someone who had discarded him so publicly and cruelly? But the more he thought about that night, the more he replayed the smug smile on Emily's face, the way she relished his humiliation, the more he realized walking away would mean letting her win completely. She had already stripped him of his dignity in front of her colleagues. If he signed quietly, he would be nothing more than the obedient trial husband she had painted him to be. No, that wasn't going to happen. Daniel's mind began to shift from pain to calculation. He thought about Emily's firm, about the enormous effort and risk she had taken to build it, about the investors and the clients who put their trust in her. A firm like that depended not just on legal skill, but on reputation, the fragile image of integrity that held everything together. Emily had played her cards recklessly with him, assuming he was too weak, too docile to ever strike back. She didn't know the fire she had ignited inside him. The hours passed as Daniel sat in the dim living room, the papers untouched, his thoughts growing more precise. He remembered small details Emily had let slip over the past months. Late-night phone calls with her senior partner, the nervous way she had dodged certain financial questions, the overconfidence in her belief that no one would question her methods. At the time, Daniel had brushed those details aside, not wanting to appear mistrustful. Now, they began to form a puzzle in his mind, a bigger picture of lies and shadows lurking beneath her polished exterior. By the time the first rays of dawn crept through the blinds, Daniel's sorrow had hardened into resolve. He wasn't going to beg Emily to take him back, nor was he going to crumble into the broken man she expected him to be. He was going to fight back, not with anger alone, but with precision, with patience, with a kind of justice she would never see coming. Daniel began noticing details he had once ignored, fragments of conversations, and strange behaviors that no longer felt innocent when pieced together. He remembered the late-night texts Emily claimed were urgent client matters, the sudden outbursts when he casually asked about her long hours, and the way she had started guarding her phone as though it were a vault of secrets. At first, he had chalked it up to stress. After all, opening a law firm demanded sacrifices. But now, with the sting of the divorce papers still fresh, those explanations seemed hollow. He decided to look deeper. Quietly, carefully. He couldn't confront Emily outright. Not yet. She thrived on being in control, and if he tipped his hand too early, she would cover her tracks before he had proof. So Daniel adopted patience, disguising a suspicion behind a mask of calm indifference whenever they crossed paths. To her, he appeared resigned, a man too defeated to fight. But behind that facade, he was sharpening his focus, determined to uncover what she was hiding. One evening, while Emily was still at the office, Daniel sat in her home study. He had rarely entered the space before, respecting it as her private work area. But tonight, respect no longer mattered. On the desk were neatly stacked documents, invoices, and contracts waiting for her signature. Most looked routine, but one caught his attention. A billing sheet with numbers that didn't add up. The amounts charged to a client were higher than what the listed hours reflected. At first, he thought it was an error, but then he found another, and another. Slowly, his hands flipped through the stack until a pattern emerged. Inflated hours, duplicate charges, expenses that didn't exist. Daniel's stomach churned. Emily wasn't just ambitious. She was crooked. She was padding invoices, defrauding clients, and no one seemed to have noticed. Or perhaps, he thought grimly, someone had noticed and was benefiting from it. His mind immediately went to the senior partner she admired so much, the one who had been mentoring her. Daniel recalled how often she mentioned him, how animated she became whenever she spoke about his support and influence. The puzzle pieces began to snap into place, each revelation heavier than the last. The affair, the fraud, the public humiliation. It all began to look less like chance and more like a carefully orchestrated plan. Emily hadn't simply grown tired of their marriage. She had outgrown him in her own eyes, choosing instead to align herself with someone she believed could elevate her status and help her cover her schemes. Daniel clenched his fists as he realized how deeply she had underestimated him. Determined to confirm his suspicions, he started shadowing her schedule, paying attention to the nights she claimed to be working late. One Thursday evening, instead of driving home after work, he parked his car discreetly a block away from her firm and waited. Hours passed, the building lights flickered off one by one, and finally, Emily emerged not alone, but with the very partner Daniel suspected. They didn't act like colleagues leaving after a long day. Their closeness, the casual brush of her hand on his arm, spoke of something far more intimate. Daniel snapped photos quietly, each click of the camera a small victory, evidence she could never deny. The betrayal cut deeper than he imagined. It wasn't just the affair. It was a realization that she had rewritten their entire marriage as a temporary phase while building her real future behind his back. He thought of the nights she had smiled at him, reassured him of her love, only to meet another man once he was asleep. His chest ached, but instead of despair, a strange clarity took over. This wasn't just about his pride anymore. Emily had crossed into dangerous territory. Fraud, corruption, betrayal. Her empire wasn't built on strength but on lies, and Daniel knew lies had a way of collapsing under the right pressure. Back at home, he organized everything. Photos of her with a partner, copies of suspicious invoices, dates, times, patterns. The evidence grew into a file thick enough to ruin careers, reputations, and possibly send people to prison. He studied it late into the night, his heart pounding with both dread and exhilaration. Emily thought she had stripped him of power, but what she didn't know was that he now held hers in the palm of his hand. Daniel didn't confront Emily immediately. That would have been too easy, too impulsive. And he wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him lash out in anger. Instead, he chose silence. When she breezed into the house late at night with flimsy excuses about client meetings, he simply nodded, his face unreadable. When she glanced at him with that smug confidence, as though expecting to crumble, he gave her nothing. He cooked his own meals, slept on his side of the bed without asking questions, and carried himself with a calm detachment that unsettled her more than arguments ever could. Emily mistook his quiet for surrender. She told herself Daniel had accepted defeat, that he would eventually sign the divorce papers without resistance, just as she had predicted. She laughed more freely at her office, grew bolder with her late-night rendezvous, and flaunted her new life without hesitation. To her, Daniel had become irrelevant, an outdated chapter she could discard while she basked in the glow of her new beginnings. But in reality, Daniel was gathering strength. Every moment of silence was a decision. Every step back was calculated. He spent his days working as usual, but his evenings were consumed with research, strategy, and meticulous organization of everything he had discovered. The fraudulent invoices, the inflated billing, the photos of Emily with her senior partner, all of it carefully cataloged. He even reached out discreetly to a friend he trusted, someone who had connections in accounting and law, to help him verify the financial irregularities. Each confirmation fueled him, transforming his grief into resolve. Yet even as he built his case, Daniel carried the heavy weight of betrayal in his chest. There were nights when he sat alone in the living room, staring at their wedding photo on the mantel, remembering the vows they had exchanged, the promises whispered in the dark. How had it all soured into this? At times, he felt the sting of heartbreak so sharply that it nearly derailed his focus. But then he would hear her voice again in his memory, mocking him as a trial husband, and the fire inside him would roar back to life. He refused to be her joke, her discarded experiment. When he finally left the house one evening, he did so quietly, deliberately. He packed a single bag with essentials, left the rest of his belongings untouched, and walked out the door without saying a word. He didn't slam it, didn't leave a note, didn't give Emily the drama she might have been expecting. Instead, he slipped away like a shadow, his absence speaking louder than confrontation ever could. He checked into a modest apartment across town, one that offered him anonymity and distance from a place that had become poisoned with lies. The small space suited him. It was quiet, uncluttered, and free of her presence. Here, he could think clearly, away from her manipulations. The solitude allowed him to refine his plan, to study every angle of what would come next. Each night, under the dim glow of a single lamp, he spread out the evidence across the table and pieced together the story of her deceit like a puzzle. The more he worked, the more he realized that Emily's empire wasn't invincible. It looked polished on the surface, but underneath, it was riddled with cracks, ethical violations, financial fraud, and an affair that could topple her reputation in an instant. She had built her castle on sand, and Daniel was prepared to be the tide that swept it away. Still, he moved with patience. Revenge wasn't just about retaliation. It was about timing, precision, and impact. He wanted her to feel what he had felt. Not just a sting, but a collapse so complete that she would never forget the day she underestimated him. Daniel's suspicions had already been sharpened by that night outside the law firm, when he'd seen Emily leaving with her senior partner, their closeness betraying far more than a professional relationship. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. He needed irrefutable proof, something so undeniable that Emily and her accomplice couldn't talk their way out of it. So he began following patterns. Emily's calendar, her late-night client dinners, the gaps between her text responses, all of it painted a picture of secrecy. Daniel started keeping notes, meticulously recording times and dates, building a timeline that matched too perfectly with the man she claimed was only her mentor. One night, Daniel positioned his car discreetly outside an upscale hotel downtown. He had tracked her phone location with a small app he had installed months ago, originally intended for emergencies, but now it revealed truths she thought she had hidden. Sure enough, Hurt lingered at the hotel longer than any meeting should have. Hours passed. His chest tightened as he watched businessmen and women flow in and out of the revolving doors, until at last he saw them, Emily and her partner, emerging together. They didn't carry the stiff distance of colleagues. No. Their shoulders brushed as they walked, their hands briefly touching before she laughed at something he whispered. Daniel lifted his phone, snapping photos through the windshield, each click capturing betrayal in crystal clarity. It wasn't just once. Over the following weeks, Daniel repeated the process. Different restaurants, different evenings, but always the same man by her side. He built a collection of photos. Emily's smile aimed not at her husband, but at another man. Her eyes glowed with a warmth that had once been his. The evidence piled up, undeniable, damning. What struck Daniel most wasn't just the affair. It was how recklessly she behaved. Emily no longer cared about hiding it, at least not from the public. She had convinced herself that Daniel was too weak to fight back, too broken to lift his head, and that arrogance became her blind spot. Each careless display of affection between her and the partner added fuel to Daniel's quiet fire. The final piece of proof came on a night when Daniel followed them to the senior partner's suburban home. He parked a few houses down, the engine off, the street quiet except for the distant hum of crickets. His eyes locked onto the driveway as Emily stepped out of the car and slipped her arm around the man's waist, walking into the house as though it were second nature. Hours later, as the lights in the house flickered off one by one, Daniel snapped one last photo. Emily standing at the window in nothing but a robe, her silhouette framed against the curtains. It was the proof he didn't want but needed. He drove away in silence, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on him but also hardening his resolve. It was no longer about heartbreak alone. It was about justice. Emily had mocked him, humiliated him, and discarded him, believing she could step into a glittering new life without consequences. But Daniel now held the truth, the affair, the lies, the fraud. And with every piece of evidence collected, the scales began to tip in his favor. Daniel knew the affair alone could tarnish Emily's image, but it wasn't enough to destroy her. People could forgive infidelity, sweep it under the rug, or spin it into gossip that faded with time. What would truly bring her down was exposing the foundation of her firm. The money that kept it alive, the trust her clients had placed in her. That's where the cracks ran deepest, and Daniel was determined to pry them open. He began by revisiting the invoices he had discovered in her study. The numbers had gnawed at him from the moment he first saw them. Hours inflated, double billing, suspicious consulting fees, with no explanation. But this time, he didn't stop at glancing. He scanned every page, creating digital copies, and highlighted every irregularity. He then reached out quietly to an old friend, Martin, a forensic accountant he'd known since college. Over coffee, Daniel slid the copies across the table, careful not to mention Emily's name at first. He just asked Martin to look them over. Within days, Martin confirmed what Daniel suspected. The discrepancies weren't accidents. They were deliberate, a pattern of fraud threaded through the documents, subtle enough that casual eyes might overlook it, but glaringly obvious to someone trained to spot financial manipulation. Daniel's stomach turned as Martin explained how the numbers showed systematic overcharging of clients, skimming funds, and even funneling money into accounts that didn't belong to firm. This wasn't just a misstep. It was a full-scale scheme, one that could lead to legal consequences if exposed. The deeper Daniel dug, the uglier it became. He traced payments and found that some of the consultants Emily's firm had billed didn't even exist. Others were shell companies linked back to the senior partner she was seeing. The affair wasn't just personal. It was part of corruption. Together, they were milking clients, padding their own pockets, and presenting themselves as rising stars in the legal world. The realization left Daniel shaken, but also strangely invigorated. The more he uncovered, the more he felt in control of the narrative. Emily thought she had stripped him of power, that serving him divorce papers at her grand opening had ended his role in her life. But now, Daniel held the threads of her downfall in his hands. If he pulled hard enough, her entire empire could unravel. He spent nights hunched over his laptop, cross-referencing documents, piecing together connections, and building a timeline. Every invoice, every suspicious payment, every late-night rendezvous, it all told a story of greed and betrayal. By the time he was done, Daniel had assembled a portfolio thick enough to make even the most confident attorney break into a sweat. There were moments when he paused, staring at the evidence spread before him, wondering how he had ever loved someone capable of such deceit. The Emily he had married, the woman who once whispered promises of forever, had been replaced by a stranger, ambitious, ruthless, and willing to betray anyone who stood in her way. But instead of breaking him, that realization steeled him. He no longer mourned what they had lost. He was preparing for what she would lose. Daniel knew revenge couldn't happen in the shadows. Emily had humiliated him publicly, calling him a trial husband in front of her peers, serving him divorce papers as if it were part of the show. If he wanted justice to cut as deep as hers had, it had to be just as public. if not more. Quietly dismantling her career was enough. She needed to watch her empire collapse in front of the same audience that once applauded her. The opportunity came faster than he expected. A prestigious legal conference was scheduled downtown, a gathering of attorneys, judges, and investors, the very people Emily had been desperate to impress. She was slated to give a keynote speech about ethics and law, a cruel irony given the evidence Daniel now held. As soon as he heard about the event, he knew it was the perfect stage. In the weeks leading up to the conference, Daniel refined his plan. He gathered all his evidence: the fraudulent invoices, the shell companies, the photos of her affair, and compiled them into a sleek presentation. He wasn't sloppy about it. Every claim was backed by proof, every detail verifiable. He even consulted with Martin again to ensure the financial data was airtight, impossible to dismiss as coincidence. By the time the conference date arrived, Daniel's file was bulletproof. On the morning of the event, he dressed carefully, choosing a tailored suit that gave him the air of confidence he hadn't felt in months. He walked into the grand hall, unnoticed at first, blending into the crowd of professionals. The air buzzed with polite chatter, the clinking of coffee cups, the shuffle of polished shoes across marble floors. When Emily finally appeared on stage, radiant in her designer dress, Daniel felt the old sting of betrayal rise in his chest. But this time, it didn't consume him, it fueled him. She spoke with her usual poise, her voice clear and confident as she lectured on integrity, transparency, and the importance of trust between attorneys and clients. Daniel almost laughed at the hypocrisy. The very words that once inspired admiration now sounded hollow, rehearsed, and false. And soon, everyone else would see them for what they were. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. That was his cue. Daniel rose slowly, the weight of his evidence heavy in his hands, and stepped toward the front. Conversations hushed as people noticed him. He introduced himself calmly, his voice steady, and requested permission to address the audience. Curious, the moderator allowed it. Emily's smile faltered for the first time as she spotted him standing there, eyes sharp, shoulders squared. With deliberate precision, Daniel began presenting the truth. He laid out the fraudulent invoices, the shell accounts, the evidence of financial misconduct, all displayed clearly on the projector screen. Gasps rippled through the crowd as each page appeared. Then came the photos of Emily with her senior partner, their so-called professional relationship, exposed for what it really was. Daniel didn't need to embellish or shout. The facts spoke for themselves, and the silence of the audience carried more weight than any accusation ever could. Emily's face drained of color. She stammered, trying to interject, but the damage was already done. Judges whispered to one another, investors scowled, and colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The applause she had basked in moments earlier was replaced with crushing silence, the sound of reputation shattering. Daniel didn't stay to watch the aftermath in full. He left the stage as calmly as he had entered, his heart pounding not with fear, but with the satisfaction of reclaiming the dignity she had stolen from him. Behind him, the whispers grew louder, and Emily's carefully constructed empire began to crumble right where she had once thought herself untouchable. The fallout was immediate, brutal, and unstoppable. By the time Daniel walked out of the conference hall, Emily's phone was already buzzing with calls she couldn't afford to answer. The judges she had boasted about impressing now questioned every case she had touched. Her investors, once eager to back her firm, demanded explanations, some even pulling their funding within hours. What she had built with ambition and arrogance unraveled like thread tugged from a fragile seam. News traveled fast in legal circles. Within days, whispers turned into headlines. Promising young attorney accused of fraud, affair with senior partner exposed. The photos Daniel had revealed circulated across professional networks, and soon enough, mainstream outlets caught wind of the scandal. The image Emily had worked so hard to polish, brilliant, ethical, unshakable, was tarnished beyond repair. Clients abandoned her firm in droves, terrified of being associated with corruption. Colleagues distanced themselves, some even testifying that they had long suspected irregularities but lacked the courage to speak. At home, the silence that once gave her power now suffocated her. Emily sat alone in their grand house, surrounded by luxury she could no longer enjoy. The senior partner who had promised her the world vanished almost overnight, leaving her to shoulder the scandal alone. Without his protection, she was vulnerable, and the same colleagues who once praised her now sharpened their knives to save themselves. Meanwhile, Daniel watched from a distance, not with glee, but with a steady calm. He hadn't needed to shout or beg for justice. The truth had done the work for him. Friends who once pitted him now reached out with quiet respect, recognizing the strength it had taken to endure humiliation and rise above it. For the first time in months, Daniel felt the heavy weight of betrayal lifting from his chest, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Emily tried to fight back, hiring lawyers, issuing statements, even framing herself as a victim of a smear campaign. But no amount of spin could erase the paper trail Daniel had exposed. The fraud was undeniable, the affair too public to bury. Her law license came under review, her firm faced investigations, and the wall she had built so high around herself collapsed inward. Daniel didn't need to interfere further. Her downfall unfolded on its own, fueled by her arrogance and her choices. All he had done was shine a light on the truth she tried to bury. As the storm around Emily reached its peak, Daniel finally felt the clarity he had been waiting for. He hadn't destroyed her. She had destroyed herself, and all he did was remove the mask she wore so carefully. Watching her empire collapse wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about closure, about proving to himself that he wasn't powerless, that her cruelty hadn't defined his worth. Weeks later, Daniel stood in front of the mirror, buttoning the cuffs of his shirt before heading out to meet old friends for dinner. His reflection no longer showed the broken man who had been humiliated at that law firm opening. It showed someone steadier, stronger, with lines of pain turned into lessons. The bitterness that once clouded him was gone. What remained was a quiet pride. He had faced betrayal, endured the sting of public humiliation, and still walked away with his dignity intact. Emily, on the other hand, became a ghost in his world. He didn't chase updates about her downfall. He didn't need to. She was simply gone, erasing the path he had chosen for himself. His life was no longer tied to her choices, her manipulations, or her cruelty. The title she had once mocked him with, trial husband, no longer carried any weight. If anything, it reminded him that sometimes trials are what shape a man into who he's meant to be. Daniel stepped into the night with a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in years. The chapter with Emily was closed, not with bitterness, but with strength. She had tried to shatter him in public, but in the end, it was she who stood in ruins while he walked away whole. His revenge wasn't just her downfall, it was his rebirth.